Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our next session in MSCSA's series of educational webinars. This afternoon, we're going to be talking about effective tuition consultation and provide an overview to all of you about what the consultation process should look like, what steps you can follow to make sure that the process on your campus is effective, and we're going to review what resources are available to you if you run into challenges or have any questions. Just a few housekeeping pieces that serve all of our webinars. We are recording this webinar today, and it will be available on our website for others to listen to and to view. So if you do ask questions during the call, or if we have any discussion about a specific issue that's happening, please know that that is being recorded and will be published to our website. Secondly, if I could make sure everyone has their microphones on their end muted during the webinar, I would appreciate it so we don't pick up any background noise. I will unmute your microphones and allow you to do so as well at the end of the webinar when we have time for questions. That's all the housekeeping pieces I have for you. Thank you very much for joining us this afternoon, and we'll go ahead and get started. In today's webinar on effective tuition consultation, we'll be going over an overview of what the process looks like on campus. We'll be looking at different tips, and I'll be providing you some advice to make sure that the process is smooth on your campus. We'll be talking about writing the letter that each Senate president is responsible for writing to the chancellor and the board of trustees on this process. Talk about how to make that letter as strong as it can be and be professional and represent your Senate well. And lastly, we will be talking about what resources are available to you in your Senate moving forward in this process. So what is consultation? On a very basic level, the process is really just about administration talking about the college budget and getting feedback from students on campus. And the two words that are the most important in this description are discussion, that consultation should really be a two-way street. It should be the administration informing the students about what's going on, talking to them about the budget proposals that are out there, explaining why, and then two, getting feedback from those student leaders, taking that feedback into consideration, and maybe adjusting their budget proposal as a result of student questions or concerns or opinion. So really think about consultation as a conversation, a two-way communication between administration and the students. We're going to talk a little bit first about how the budget on your campus is set. The budget for your individual college is set annually. It's a proposal put together by many administrators, but signed off on by your college president, and then ultimately submitted to the chancellor and the board of trustees for approval. However, your college president and your administration, they do have some limitations on what the budget looks like. And some of those restrictions are things that you probably already can imagine on your own campus. The first is the amount of state funding that each college is receiving and that the system is receiving as a whole from the state. So the amount of money the legislature gives the system is very important to what campus budgets ultimately look like. Your budget's also restricted by enrollment. Over half of the tuition, or over half of the revenue your college receives now comes from tuition and not from the state. And in most campuses, it's about 3/4 the revenue comes from tuition, and at some campuses, it's even higher than that. So with that in mind, when your enrollment levels on campus fluctuate, that can have a great impact on the amount of revenue that your school has coming in. And enrollment can be looked at in a couple of different ways. It can be looked at in terms of your total FYE, your full-time students that are attending, but it can also be headcount. And many of our campuses have seen in recent years where the headcount on our campus, the number of students coming in through the door, is actually grown, but the number of full-time students has declined. So more students are coming through those doors, but they're taking fewer credits, and that can ultimately impact tuition revenue as well. The next is personnel costs. Personnel costs account for 70 to 80% of a college budget. So depending on what bargaining agreements are negotiated by the state and by the MNSCU system, and depending on the number of employees you have, the type of bargaining unit that they're assigned to, all of those factors can determine how much cost on your campus is going to personnel. And that's salaries, that's benefits, it's all of those pieces. Next is the cost of programming. Technical programs are much more expensive to deliver in general than community college, general education, liberal arts courses. So if you're at a campus that's very heavily focused on technical degree programs, or you have a couple of flagship programs that are very expensive to offer, the cost of your programming can really dictate what your budget looks like. In a lot of cases, if you have expensive programs, the amount of money your college gets from the system will be a little bit higher, but there is a cap to that. So in some cases, you might be seeing additional costs on your campus just based on the kind of programs that you offer. And then lastly, board action. You could also say legislative action. If legislators or the board of trustees that govern the MNSCU system decide that they want budgets spent in certain ways, they can dictate that. They can also put limits on the amount of tuition that can be charged, the percentage that fees or tuition are increased, any of those things. It can be impacted on a statewide level by that decision-making body. So that's a little bit about how the budget's set. We're going to talk in more detail about what's required as part of the consultation process. First, student input is required. I mentioned that briefly, saying that students are supposed to provide feedback on the budget, but having that real engaged student input is essential to the consultation process. You should be provided with financial materials about the state of your budget on campus, as well as specific components of the budget. Often I hear from students that they're not given the materials that they feel like they need in order to be informed or to provide that good student input that we talked about. If that's the case, it's very important that you're providing your administration with your expectations early on. So before you have a meeting, once that meeting is first scheduled on the calendar, let your administration know what type of financial materials you're going to want. And we're going to talk in a little more detail later in the webinar about what are some ideas for what materials you should ask for. Also required is the ability for students to ask questions. So there should be a Q&A period, both at the consultation meetings, but also between meetings. There should be an openness, and you should have the ability as a Senate president or as a student leader to send an email to your CFO and ask a question if one arises between meetings. That's important to the process. Also, the ability to have informed discussion. So I mentioned that this conversation is a two-way street. So that means that your administration should be listening, just as much, if not more, as they're speaking or presenting information. So engaging students in a real conversation. And then lastly, a consultation letter is required at the end of the process. Your Senate president needs to write a letter on behalf of the Senate to tell the board and the chancellor how the process went. And again, we'll talk a little bit later about what that letter might look like and what needs to be included. So before we talk about what topics you should be covering in consultation, we're going to talk a little bit about the current environment and what's happening right now on a statewide level. So what's going on in Minnesota? We have a state budget deficit of about $1.5 billion. And that sounds like a lot of money, and it certainly is. I could use an additional $1 billion in my pocket. But that's actually a much smaller deficit than the state has previously seen in the last few biennia. So there is a deficit that needs to be solved, but it's less daunting than maybe we've seen in the past. We do also we've seen cuts in our system. Right now, funding of our institutions through the state is at 2006 levels. So what we've seen is as state dollars have decreased, tuition dollars have gone up in order to fill that gap. So students are paying much more out of pocket than they previously were. Um, I mentioned that at a lot of campuses, students are covering 2/3 the cost of education through tuition. It used to be the opposite. Even just 10 years ago, students were paying 1/3 of the cost, and the state was covering 2/3 of the cost. So we've definitely seen a reversal in the way that your college receives revenue and is able to spend money. As a result of that, we obviously have seen tuition skyrocket. In Minnesota, at our 2-year colleges, we have very high tuition. We pay the third highest tuition and fees in the country, and that's based on the tuition and fees that we charge, the sticker price to student. But even if you look at net cost, if you take all federal grant aid out, if you take all state grant and scholarship aid out of the equation, half of our 2-year community technical colleges are still among the highest in the nation in terms of cost. And so that's a real concern that I know many of our institutions are trying to address. The chancellor and his staff are looking at, and you as students should be concerned about as well. And then MnSCU has submitted a request to the legislature this year for the next 2 years, and they're asking for to receive the same amount of base funding as they've previously received, plus an additional $97 million over the next 2 years. That $97 million would be used for various initiatives. If you're interested in a more specific breakdown of that request and what the money would be used for on a statewide level, you can find that information on our website at www.mscsa.org. There's a breakdown of that request. But part of that request is also a recognition that tuition probably will rise a little in the next 2 years. The board considers these to be moderate tuition increases, and it would amount to about $145 in each year for a full-time student, which is about 3% in terms of an increase. So MnSCU submitted their request of $97 million. Just this week, Governor Dayton released his budget recommendation to the legislature. And in that budget recommendation, he also proposed providing the MnSCU system with additional funds. So he proposed giving MnSCU $80 million in additional state appropriations over the next 2 years. So that's $17 million less than the system has requested, but it's still a large chunk of new money after several years of cuts to the system. So that's something that could positively impact tuition rates in our campuses. From here, it will go to the legislature, and the House and the Senate will have to create their own budgets, pass those, and then come to an agreement between both bodies as well as the governor. So we've got a long spring ahead of us legislatively on this issue, but that's going to definitely impact your campuses. There might be some uncertainty over the next few months that you hear from administrators and others about not knowing exactly how much money your campus will have next year because the legislature hasn't finished their work yet. So that is true, and that's something that you'll need to consider in your ongoing discussions. But there's a lot of groundwork you can be doing over the early spring here to make sure that you have all your bases covered and you're as informed as possible before you know what the final number might be. So how do you start this whole consultation process? Many of you on the call are going to be at very different places in the consultation process right now. We encourage everyone to start meeting early and meet often throughout the year. So most of our campuses started meeting last fall, and I think that's wonderful. I do know that there are some that haven't started yet as of the new semester, but if you're in that boat, if you're one of those campuses, it's not too late. It's not too late to structure a really great consultation process. So, sit down with your advisor, and request a meeting with your administration to start talking about consultation and what the budget looks like. And if you've already started, awesome. That's great. Gold star for you. Moving forward, it's important that you continue to meet on a regular basis. So if you don't have meetings scheduled over the next few months, get those on the calendar now and get started. Once you have those meetings scheduled and you have that first meeting to look at budget materials, the first step in getting informed is to understand where your college is at. So you need to ask questions and get information about the financial state of your college, but also what has been going on with your college budget over the last 2, 5, even 10 years to understand that pattern in the history a little bit. And making sure that you're asking questions as part of that process. You don't need to wait till the end of the consultation process to ask questions. It'd be way too overwhelming at that point. You're going to be given lots of budget information, lots of spreadsheets, piles and piles of paper. So make sure you're asking questions as you go. Try to break it down into manageable bites that you can digest and fully feel informed. And then once you know where your college is at and where it's been, you need to learn where your college is going. So asking questions again about that information you're given. So you wanna be asking about enrollment and what they expect the financial situation to be and how they plan to address those. But don't worry too much right now about what are those specific questions or what goes into those understandings. We'll talk about that a little bit later. But that's basically the start of the process. Get those meetings scheduled, figure out where you've been, where you're at, and where you're going. So just think about it in those very simple terms. So after you've started, then what do? You want to review the proposals that your president or your CFO or your other administrators present to you. Review those proposals, not just about tuition, although that's a very important piece, but of the budget as a whole, and have them break that down for you. And again, ask those questions that you need to ask to understand. Once you review the proposals, you want to provide feedback. And you want to ask any additional questions that come up between meetings. Then, hopefully, that feedback is taken into account by your administration, considered carefully, and they might make some changes or amend their proposal as a result of that feedback. If they do that, you want to make sure you review the final proposal again. And again, that's a great opportunity to ask those final questions you have or raise concerns that still exist. If you want to, as a Senate, you can also vote at that time. You're not required. I repeat, you're not required to take a position on the budget or on tuition. You could just be part of the process, be part of the conversation, and remain neutral. But many campuses, many senates like to take a vote in order to express, at least symbolically, their agreement or their disagreement with the proposal or with specific aspects of the proposal, like the tuition rate, any of the fees that are changing, any program closures. That's your opportunity to weigh in as a Senate. So make sure that you're scheduling those votes and you have an informed Senate so they can weigh in effectively. And then lastly, you're going to write your letter to the board and the chancellor. That's the very last step, and you want to make sure you're putting a lot of thought and professionalism into that letter. The board and the chancellor, they read all of those letters that are submitted and they take them very, very seriously. So the letter is in a lot of ways your leverage, that if the process doesn't go well, if students are not informed as they should be, if you're shut out of the process, that's your opportunity to talk to the board and the chancellor about it. But we don't want it to get to that point. That should be a last resort. Really what we want to make sure is happening is that students are having a good process. So well before you get to that point, if you're having any problems or you're facing any challenges or you have outstanding questions in this part of the process, please do reach out to our office, reach out to me, and let me figure out how we can intervene to make sure that you can write a positive letter at the end of this process, because that's our goal. So a little bit about the timeline. It's very ambiguous at this point, again, because the legislature is just beginning their work, and we don't know at what point in the legislative session they'll ultimately decide on a budget. But until April, consultation should be occurring. You should be meeting, at least monthly between now and April to talk through these issues and get information. Late April, that's when your letter is going to be due from your Senate to the Chancellor and the Board of Trustees. The system office will publish a due date for those letters, but they haven't done so yet. Once that's announced, we'll make sure that that's available on our website. We'll send it out in our association update, which is a great reason to subscribe to our weekly email update. If you're not already on our list, you can sign up on our website. And through other means, we'll communicate that date. So make sure you're keeping an eye out for that deadline. Then in June, that's when the board generally will approve the operating budgets of the system as a whole and all of our institutions. And that includes tuition and fees. So as of June, that's when they'll get the official stamp to approve those rates. So that's the basic timeline that you should be looking at. So let's get into a little bit more detail about those questions. What should you be asking for as part of the consultation process? First is, what's the state of the budget on your campus? Are you in the red? Are you in the black? Have you been running a deficit or having to shift money to make one-time expenditures over the last couple of tough years? What does the budget projections, what do they look like? You want to ask also about projections on enrollment. Because tuition makes up such a large percentage of your revenue stream on campus, those enrollment shifts can really make a difference. So are you expecting more students, more full-time students, more part-time students, more students in a certain program and decreases in enrollment in other programs? That you should be getting a report on all of those pieces. You also want to ask, in light of the difficult economic circumstances we've had, what cuts have your campus already made over the last few years in order to decrease their expenses? Or what cuts or expenditure reductions are they proposing for the next 2 years? You also want to look at the level of reserves on your campus. A reserve fund is money that's set aside on a campus. It's not earmarked. It's set aside in a reserve to pay for emergencies, contingencies, or one-time expenses that come up. And so you should be looking at what your level of reserves are on campus. And generally, you want to see a reserve level between 5 and 7% of your operating budget. So take a look at that. If you have a higher reserve, you can ask some questions about how they intend to spend that down, or what they would spend that down on. If you have a low reserve, you want to ask, why it was so low, or what one-time expenditures they've had to make that's kept the reserve at that level. Additionally, you should ask about tuition increases. Of course, that's the biggie, right? So you want to know, what is your tuition rate going to be next year? But don't just be satisfied with having your administration present a rate to you and taking that into consideration. You really want to see how the budget would have to give and take in order to accommodate different tuition increases. So if your administration comes to you and says, as part of the budget, we're proposing a tuition increase of 3%. That's great. You should learn about that, figure out, the rationale and how that would help your school. But you should also ask, okay, can you also show us what the budget would have to look like if we only raise tuition 2%, or 1%, or 4%, looking at those different scenarios to truly understand how tuition impacts the rest of the budget decisions on campus. Similar to tuition, you want to look at any fee changes that are being proposed. You want to make sure that students were involved in the process to decide to recommend a fee change. You want to make sure that you understand the rationale for why the fee is changing. And again, you can ask for different scenarios on the fee too. What if we didn't raise the student life fee, but instead we did X, Y, Z? Ask those questions. Make that part of the conversation. Next on the list are online rates. All of our institutions now have a separate rate that they charge for online tuition. And it's higher than what it costs to attend on-ground classes. And so digging into those rates a little bit and understanding how they set them and what changes are being proposed is important. And we're going to talk in more detail about that in a minute. And then lastly, differential rates. Not everyone on your campus pays the same tuition rate. Students that are in more expensive programs like nursing, they pay a different rate of tuition in a lot of cases. Or even just a single course might cost more to deliver, so they charge a higher rate of tuition. And within the MINSCU system, there's hundreds of differential tuition rates. So it's important for you to understand a little bit about your own rates on campus and how they're determined. And so we'll go through that in a minute as well. But let's step back to online rates for a moment and talk about what's included in those rates. You want to make sure when you're talking about online rates with your administration that you're asking them to define what online means. What kind of class is included in online? Is it only classes where it's 100% online? What about classes where you only go to class physically once a week, but then you have assignments or discussions throughout the week online? Do those count? You also want to ask, what is the rationale for those rates, or how are those rates set? We know that the rate's higher than on-ground tuition, but why is that, and why is it higher or lower compared to the online rates of other schools? Looking at the enrollment in online classes and programs, if they offer 4 sections of an online course, are they being filled, or could they reduce it to a couple sections and still be at capacity? I mentioned looking at what other schools are charging for online tuition rates, so make sure you're comparing those rates across the system. And then also, this is your opportunity to raise any issues that students have with online, to bring that up to the administration. One example I've heard from students is that sometimes schools will start offering more sections of a class online than on ground, and it's a required course. And what happens is the on ground classes get filled, and then students end up being forced to take online courses, which they don't want to do, and they have to pay a higher rate to do that. So if you have issues like that could be addressed in the budget, that's a great time to bring those up. Okay, so let's move back to course and program differentials and what questions you can ask around that. For each rate that's being charged differentially on your campus, you want to make sure you're getting a breakdown of the higher rate. How is that rate being spent? How is that additional money being spent? Is it on equipment? Is it to support other courses in the program? How is it being used? Make sure that you're speaking with students in that program to hear from them what they think about that differential rate, and what they think about any change to that rate, and what they think about their program. And then make sure that you're looking also at what other colleges charge for similar type programs and courses. Just because a program or course is similar doesn't mean they should charge the same rate. There are a lot of differences between programs that can't necessarily be seen just in the way it's titled, but you can get some idea of what the general pattern is across the state. So those are some general ideas for questions around online and differential. If you feel like this was a lot of information today, I totally understand and I agree with you. So I encourage you to, a little bit later when we look at resources, to review the toolkit that we have available online. It asks all of these questions that are here in a checklist type format, so you can actually just check off and make sure you're not forgetting to get information on any of these valuable components of the budget. So I do want to move on now to the letter itself, and what that's going to look like at the end of the process. So you'll write a letter at the end of the process directed to the Chancellor and the Board of Trustees. And in that letter, you're going to talk about the process. They really want to know whether or not you were full participants in the budget conversation. They want to make sure that you were truly engaged and informed, and given the information you needed to feel like you were involved. And so you should comment and let them know whether or not that was good. If you want to, and if your Senate voted on any components of the proposal, including whether or not you support tuition or fees, that can also go in the letter. And if your Senate does take a position on any of those things, I encourage you to put that in the letter, because otherwise it's likely that the chancellor and the board won't know about those positions you took. You want to make sure that you're using your own words in the letter. In a few minutes, we'll look at a template letter, a sample of what you can use to use as a starting point for your own letter. But you shouldn't copy that and just change names and dates, right? It's important that you use your own words, and here's why. The chancellor and the board really want to make sure that you're informed that this process was a sincere conversation with students. And so if you're not able to or choose not to talk about the process in your own words, it doesn't give the impression that you were that full participant or that you were really engaged. So making sure that you could take others' templates or samples or ideas or former letters to use as a basis, but make sure that you're fundamentally writing about the process like you in your own language. In the letter, you want to make sure, obviously, that you're professional. Make sure that you're honest, though, about how the process went, and be very thoughtful about what you put in that letter. Remember that anything you write in that letter is going to go straight to the chancellor and the board of trustees. It will be published for the public to look at, for the media to look at. So it's essential that you're doing what you can to continue the great relationship that you've cultivated with others on your campus. And that doesn't mean not to be honest. If the process didn't go well and we weren't able to make it be a good process for you, you should be honest. But even if you can't say that the process was good, you can do so professionally. So it's important to really keep all of that in mind. Once you have the letter, a draft of the letter ready to go, you want to share that letter with others. Run it by our office for feedback. Share it with your advisor. Share it with your Senate, your provost. Make sure that everybody gets the opportunity to look at it so there aren't any surprises at the board. And then if you run into a challenge or you're not sure where to start, make sure you're asking MSDSA for help. We're happy to do that for you. So that's the basic overview of the process and some general advice I have for you moving forward with this process. I know that all of you are just going to do a stupendous job over the next few months, and when I take a look at those letters, it's going to be either glowing reviews of how it's gone, or it's going to detail thoughtfully some very real work that the campuses have done or need to do in the future to make the process better. You guys are rock stars, and I know that you are absolutely going to do great work representing your students. But before I end the webinar and open it up for questions, I do just want to talk a little bit about one resource that's available for you. And that is our consultation toolkit. We've handed these out in paper form to the Senate presidents, but it's also available electronically on our website. So I will take you all there on a journey with me to our homepage. So this is the MSCSA homepage, www.mscsa.org. If you go to this homepage, on the left-hand side, you'll see Get Involved with MSCSA. And you'll see Media Menu. Under Media Menu, there's a link for webinars. You can click there in the future to review this webinar or any others that we've done. So that's a resource for you. But under Get Involved in MSCSA, if you click on Advocacy Efforts, it's the first thing on the page. And you'll see our Tuition Consultation Toolkit for this year. You can also look at the presentation that I gave last December for another overview of the process. But let's take a look at the toolkit. I want to go through those pieces for you so you understand what's available. The first few pages, we have a list of frequently asked questions, things that have come up that I've been asked by students or I've seen happen on campus, so you can get answers to those kind of quick questions. everything from an overview of the process to more detailed information on what a reserve is, to how fees are determined and what fees are appropriate to charge. Here are the checklists that we talked about. The first is a checklist about the process, making sure you know to set up the meeting, that you're having discussion, that you're writing the letter, that you're staying on track with the steps of the process. And then the next checklist is about the topics, things that you want to make sure you ask about. And all of those we went through today, but this is just in a format that might be better for your Senate in terms of putting together a consultation plan. The next piece is just some hints and advice for having a smooth consultation process. Many of those we've talked about today, making sure, of course, that you're asking those questions, that you are still getting information even if the legislature hasn't made a budget decision yet, that you're talking to other students, that you're relationship building with your administration. Those are all very important tips to take with you. We have our timeline that we went through. And then here is a sample letter. This is, again, it's just a template. It's not something that I expect you or want you to use word for word, but it is a good thing to look at to kind of see what some of the formalities are, and then also what are components of content that you need to include. So you can see here at the top, the letters addressed to the Board of Trustees in St. Paul, and then it's addressed, here the letter is addressed to Chair Hightower, the chair of the Board of Trustees, and other members of the board. You can also address it to Chancellor Rosenstone if you prefer. And then it talks about why you're writing the letter. You're writing the letter because it's required under Minsky policy, and that you plan in the letter to talk about the consultation process. And here you're talking about how things went at the beautiful Lutefisk Community and Technical College in Lake Wobegon. And they're very proud of their student body there because everybody is a little bit above average. So the Lake Wobegon Student Senate met with their administration to consult on the budget. They put the dates in here of the consultation meetings. And then they say who attended. So you want to let them know that the right people were at the meeting, that your president was there, your CFO, and then who participated on the Senate side. It could be the full Senate, it could be your exec board, who was there. And then here it talks about a student forum being held to garner additional student input, which is a great idea for something you can do on your campus to get students as a whole more engaged on the budget. Then in this paragraph, it talks about what was presented to the Senate, that you were given materials, and it talks about the tuition proposal, that tuition, they looked at tuition from a freeze to a 3%, that they ultimately proposed a 2% tuition increase. And so here is where you really should lay out what changes are being proposed in the budget for this year. And then here, this is very important, letting them know that, hey, the consultation process was sufficient. It was a good process. Or it was a bad process. It didn't really work for us, and here's how we can make it better. That's what you need to put in the letter. And then here in the last paragraph, they talk about their Senate voting to oppose the tuition increase. And this is, if you've taken a vote as a Senate on the tuition or fees or other pieces of the budget, you can include that in the letter here. And then it talks a little bit about the rationale and why they decided to oppose it. It's perfectly okay to have a good relationship with your administration, to have a good consultation process that everybody feels satisfied by, but ultimately to disagree on tuition. That's okay. And I see that a lot in letters, so this example kind of flushes out how that might look. And then here at the end, it just talks about how they've felt as a Senate that their views were respected and taken into consideration. So if you have a good process on campus, talk about that. We want to make sure that those campuses where it's working really well are elevated as a model for other campuses to follow. So that's really an important thing. And then lastly, make sure that you include at the end your email address. And the reason for that is once you send this in via email, you'll get a reply back from the system office thanking you for the submission. So that's your receipt that they got your letter. So that's very important. One more note before we move on from the letter. You want to make sure that even though it's addressed to the Board of Trustees or the chair or the chancellor, that you're sending it to the right system office contact. And that's Kathy Hannon, and her email address is right here. You want to make sure you're also sending a copy to your college president. If you have a provost, it's going to them. And then also, this is my email address right here, and I would definitely appreciate receiving a copy of this when you send it in or before. I do eventually get copies of all the letters from the system office, but I like to be able to see them in advance so that I have an idea of how the process went and kind of where our senates are at. So I would certainly appreciate that. So that's the letter. And then at the end of the toolkit, we also include copies of all the system level policies and procedures that talk about consultation or tuition or student involvement or fees to help you understand what the requirements are of consultation and to use as a tool and a guideline for making sure that the process on your campus is as good as it can be. So that's the toolkit. I hope that you're all able to access that and use it. I know many of you on the call have been involved in our training before, or you're experienced in this process, and you're familiar with the toolkit. But please use it to share with other students on campus. Take this information back from the webinar. Show them how they can access it on the site and have your Senate or other students understand the process and what the budget is really all about. You guys have a great opportunity as student leaders to represent those students on your campus that don't have a voice or that don't understand the budget or that don't have time to be involved the way you do. So doing everything you can to provide these tools to others is really part of the education process. I'll show you my contact information is right there, my email address and my phone number, my direct line. So please don't hesitate to reach out if there's anything I can do to help you or your campus. Thanks again for joining us for this webinar on effective tuition consultation today. Thank you for taking this information back, and I hope that you have a wonderful day.